All right. Well, we'll go ahead and jump in here and get started and let people come in. I know everybody's a little cold, so maybe they won't stay in the foyer long and come in here and keep a little warm. Who do we need to remember in our prayers? I know we need to keep Sarah in our prayers. She doing better? Okay, good. I know everybody will be happy when she is back. Yep. Okay. Oh, okay. So let's remember. We also need to remember, speaking of falls, with that, Molly's mom has had some trouble with that of recent times over the last week and a half. Yeah, it's a sad situation there. Anything else that we need to remember in our prayers? Okay. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay. Definitely definitely need to remember them in our prayers. Her name's Jennifer. So definitely remember. Oh, are you bringing treats for everybody? Oh, I was like, oh, Marisha brought our treats tonight. No. All right, well, don't forget this Saturday is the foster family thing that's going on. I know Chandra and William basically have it all taken care of, but I'm sure if you're around, they would enjoy y'all coming and being a part of that. But let's pray here, and then we'll jump into class, because I'm excited about class tonight. Heavenly Father, thank you again for another beautiful day, and Father, for our time that we have together and just another day to live and to breathe. And Father, we still have so many that we are remembering in our prayers, from Roxy's niece and Jennifer and Sarah and all others, Father, that are dealing with things. We just pray that you will be with them and the doctors and their families as they're struggling and striving through things. And Father, we just pray that you will have all your blessings upon them. And Father, we do thank you for our time together and our study, and we pray that everything that we do brings glory to you and helps us draw closer to you through this period of time where we get to study. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Oh, I had missed y'all last week from a normal thing, so we were jumping into Genesis chapter 6. Now this gets another little thing that's kind of interesting. So if I was to outline this, I would almost say, if I was to take Genesis and divide it up into sections or books, I would say Genesis chapter 1 through 5 was one book. You have creation, finally getting all the way down to the 7th generation of Adam and all of that on both sides. And then I would say the second book begins right here in chapter 6. And that's all the way until we get to chapter 12, where then that's kind of starts the next book in there, because that's Abraham and his family and descendants. So I would look at this as saying, okay, now we're about to jump into the second section of Genesis in this great scheme of things. Now, when we left off in chapter 5, remember that is the line of Seth. We are sure there are more kids that Adam and Eve have, and we know that they had to have daughters in there to be able to have other kids being born. But remember this, and I'm going to say it probably multiple times here tonight even, Genesis is not an exhaustive history. There's other things happening. We're following, in particular, once we leave Adam and Eve, we're following two lines of Cain, and the other line is of Seth. Then that's where we end up with Seth. And of course, you see going all the way down there, it ends with Noah and his 3 sons, because that's where we are entering into chapter 6. Now, the picture that you have in chapter 6 is not a pretty picture. This is right before the flood and what leads up to it. So I kind of want to get this whole section in here first before we get into Noah and the flood, because we're going to bounce around verses 1 through 8 to talk about this for a second. So it begins in verse 1, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the daughters of men were attractive, and they took them as wives, any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward were the sons of God. When the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children of them, they were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Verse 5, then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intention of his thoughts of his hearts were on evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heaven, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. A lot of stuff that is throwing in there that is coming out. And even with me studying this and going through it, you see some of this being talked about in the New Testament. And to be honest with you, I never connected them until this study. So we're going to go with that. So what you have starting out here, of course, is this idea multiplying, which that goes back to creation. That was part of the blessing. Remember, the blessing in creation, not only for mankind, but also the animals, they were to be fruitful and multiply, and God was going to bless them. That's part of the creation connection in here of procreation that was taking place. And so he is talking about this and says, you have daughters being born, and then you have this phraseology. It is in verse 2, and it is in verse 4 there. The sons of God are coming, and they are taking the daughters of man. They're finding them beautiful, and they're taking them as their wives. There are 4 possibilities that commentators go for that try to answer what is this sons of God thing. To me, there's only 2 viable ones, and I will kind of talk with you about these briefly here in a second. Because within this, you also have tied in there this idea in verse 4 of the Nephilim that were giants, because Nephilim is actually a word that will also be used in Numbers chapter 13. That's when the spies are going out to spy out the land. Moses sends them to go spy out the land. They come back, and in verse 33, remember, you got the 10 spies that were like, no, we can't do it. And they said, the Nephilim are there. They're the descendants of Anak, the people of old. And we're like grasshoppers. So there is some usage of this word in another place. And you have this idea of wickedness happening. So there are 2 possibilities with the sons of God. I will give you those 2 that I think it possibly could be, and I will show you the pros and cons on both. And the reason why I'm even spending some time in this, as I said, as I dove more into this, there is a connection to the New Testament, in particular 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and the book of Jude. That's going to come out in this, and we'll talk about that in a second too. So the first possibility is the sons of God are angels. Okay, where do I get that from? In Job chapter 1 and chapter 2. If you want to look over there, you're welcome to do it. Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, you have this picture of God coming out here, and it says in verse 6 of Job chapter 1, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And this is where God and Satan has a conversation of Job back and forth. Undoubtedly, what we have is, at least during this time, Satan has freedom, and he still has some sort of connection to be able to go and be where God is with the rest of the angels. I'm not saying that's in heaven. Wherever it is, I don't know. So what does this have to do with Genesis chapter 6? In Hebrew, the same grammatical construction that is used in Job chapter 1 and chapter 2 for the angels is the exact same grammatical construction used here in Genesis chapter 6 when it says sons of God. Now, I know before you get in here, you're going to be like, okay, this is crazy that you're coming off of. Yes, I get it. I'm going to read some from history and a couple of other books that The early church even viewed as they used them. I'll just use it in that phrase. Because there is an issue. So if we talk about angels, right? Remember in Matthew, I think I've lost where it is. Is it Matthew 19? Nope, not Matthew 19. It's where Jesus is talking and they want to know, well, this man, if his wife dies and he marries another and so on and so on and so on, whose wife will be his in the afterlife? And you remember what Jesus' answer is? Well, there'll be in the afterlife, there's not giving in marriage because they're made like the angels, right? Because there's neither male nor female. So you got a problem there. The only issue, the defense I would argue back on that is he's talking about a spiritual realm, not a physical realm, okay? Whenever you see angels coming to earth, you always see them in the masculine form. And you do see them interacting with people, such as when the angels come, and we'll talk to it, when the angels come to talk to Abraham in a few chapters, they sit down and they eat together, and they take on food. So we can't necessarily just say, well, they don't have any physical traits, so therefore they could not impregnate women. Yes, I understand where all this comes from, but we have to be honest with the text on both sides. Now, let me read to you from a couple of different places. The first place I'm actually going to read from, I'll read from Josephus first. Let me read from Josephus. Remember, this is a guy we went back to. This was the overarching theme of the day of what they believed Moses was talking about. I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying this is what they thought it was talking about. This is him writing, remember, writing in the mid-1st century A.D. But for what degree of zeal they had formerly shown for virtue, they now showed by their actions a double degree of wickedness, whereby they made God their enemy. For many angels of God accompanied with women and begat sons, and proved unjust, and despisers of all that was good on account of the confidence that they had in their own strength for their traditions, that these men did resemble the acts of those whom the Grecians called giants. So remember when I first talked about part of why we study or need to study Genesis is we get all different views from certain things in Genesis. Remember I told you about, I think Ken was even talking about where did I get Hercules and all. That is where some of the mythologies that we have, the Mesopotamian myths, the Babylonian myths, comes from similar instances like this. And that is what Josephus is writing mid-1st century A.D. He is saying, at least within the Jewish population and that day and age, they believed that it was angels that was taking place here. Now I'm going to read from one other place. And this is what has a connection to the New Testament. Any of you ever heard of the book of Enoch? Okay, we got one who's had. Sort of heard of it, maybe. The book of Enoch is what is listed in the pseudepigrapha, and what that is, it was a group of Jewish apocalyptic writings around 300 BC. So this is during that intertestamental time. The early church considered the book of Enoch not canonical in the New Testament sense, but they included it in their readings and writings. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? It wasn't part of the 27 New Testament, but it was part of what we would consider the Old Testament into the New Testament. For instance, we've talked about the Apocrypha in here. It was in your Bible until about the 1800s. And that's when the Protestant side of Christianity took it out because they said it was too Catholic. And it was almost more of a thing against Catholicism than it was anything else. This would have been one of those books that they would have pulled out. So that understands. I'm going to read from some of it because you're going to listen to it and you're going to be like, that sounds very similar on some things. Okay? So this is from 1st Enoch, and this is what they were writing, and this is how they viewed this time in this. And it came to pass when the Son of Men had increased that in those days there were born to them fair and beautiful daughters. Similar to what we just read, correct? And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them, and they said to one another, "Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the children of men, and let us beget for ourselves children." Okay? Similar to what you have right here. So I'm going to go to the next chapter in here. And they took wives for themselves, and everyone chose for himself each one, and they began to go into them and were promiscuous with them, and they taught them charms and spells, and they showed them cutting roots and trees. That's going to come in later, so just hold that in your head. They became pregnant and bore large giants, and the height of them were 3,000 cubits, okay, meaning they were very big, very tall people in this. Let me go about this. They began to sin against the birds and the animals, and they devoured each other, drank their blood, and such and such. Now, go to the next chapter. And Azazel is supposedly one of the names of the fallen angels. I have no idea where they got it from, but I'm just being honest with you. Taught men to make swords and daggers and shields and breastplates, and he showed them the things after these things, and the art of making them bracelets and ornaments, and the art of marking up the eyes, and of the beautifying the eyelids, and the most precious stones, and all kinds of colored dyes. And the world was changed, and there was great impiety and much fornication, and they all went astray, and all their ways became corrupt. What does that sound like? God looks down and he sees on earth, was on thoughts of man were on evil continually, right? Okay. And then you have this, chapter 9 of Enoch. And Michael, Gabriel, looked down from heaven and saw the mass of blood that was being shed on the earth and all the iniquity that was being born. They said to one another, "Let the devastated earth cry out with the sounds of their cries up to the gates of heaven, and see what they have done. They have taught the impunity on earth, revealed the eternal secrets, etc., etc., etc." And then you have God talking to the good angels, the part of the archangels. Now, this is what I want you to pay attention to this part, because this is what ties to the New Testament. This is chapter 10 of 1 Enoch. "Bind Azazel by his hands and his feet, throw him into the darkness, and split open the desert, which is in a place, and throw him in there. And throw on him jagged and sharp stones, cover him with darkness, let him stay there forever, and cover his face so that he might not see light." What does that sound like? Satan, but hell. Which ultimately, remember what Jesus said, hell was a place that's prepared for the devil and his angels, okay? Verse 6, "And so that on that great judgment they may be hurled into the fire and restore the earth," and this is what's going to go through, and eventually the flood. So what does this have to do with the New Testament? Okay, turn, if you would, a couple places. Let's go to 1 Peter is the first place we're going to go to. 1 Peter chapter 3. Verse 18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which," watch, now this is the direct correlation to what we just read, "in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of when? Of Noah." Now that's where people connect Peter here to what we were just talking about. Next one, go to 2 Peter. We'll flip over a page to 2 Peter chapter 2. Now, if you take verse 4 and just take it out of context with it, let's read verse 4. "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept in judgment." If you take that out, we're like, what? Well, he's talking about their fall from grace, right? And God threw them in there. However, What's the next verse connect it to? Verse 5. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, which he brought through the flood and the wickedness of ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, and he connects it back to the destruction, back to the flood, and ultimately those type of destructions. So there's where some people connect what Enoch is writing to the New Testament. And there is one other place, and that is in the book of Jude. I know it's not a book that we study a lot about, but here it is. The book of Jude really throws a wrench if you want to throw Enoch out of this equation. And I know some of us probably want to, but it throws a wrench into this. In verse 14, it was also about these that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with 10,000s of the holy ones to execute judgment on all and convict all of the ungodly to all of their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all that the harsh things that these ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are grumblers, malcontents, following their own sinful desires. They are loudmouth boasters, showing favoritism to gain advantage. This is a direct quote, not from the New Testament, not from the Old Testament. This is a direct quote from the book of 1 Enoch. So we have a challenge here of Jude throwing this in here if it's a direct quote from there. So I guess what I'm saying is be careful that we just don't dismiss this because it's not a book that we have in our Bible because of all of that. Now, in fairness, let me go to the other side of what it could be. Okay? Going back to the other side of what it could be, coming off of chapter 5, is you have this 2 lines. One is the line of Cain and one is the line of Seth. And that some people attach that the sons of God were actually from the children of the lineage of Seth because they were godly people. Because Seth's line seems to stay godly in all of that, and yet they intermarry with women that are not godly, and then you see this taking up and bursting forth and taking place. However, that idea does not begin to be propagated until about the 3rd or 4th century AD. It's not in the early church, and it's not in Old Testament history. Now, which one is it? We don't know. And that's exactly right. We don't know. This is where I go back to, remember, I think sometimes we struggle with this, with things like this, because there are other things that are going on in the world that we don't always understand. God did not necessarily reveal everything that happens in the Bible, right? For instance, do we know everything that happens in the spiritual realm? Because if you can tell me that, please, you can write a book and you make lots of money. But we do get one little picture, right? Remember Elisha? When his servant's scared to death and he's like, oh, we're going to die. And Elisha prays to God, hey, will you open up his eyes to see that who's with us is against those? And what does he see? He opens up his eyes and he pulls back the veil of the spiritual world, and there's all of these chariots of fires ready to go and fight. So there's other stuff that happens that we don't understand about. What I think Moses is writing at is to connect back of saying, ultimately, the world in which he is about to destroy had moved so far from creation that it perverted itself, which even, it doesn't matter which line you want to take. Do you want to take its angels or do you want to take the line of Seth? They had so perverted God's creation that it had made it to a place that made him sick to want to be a part of. You had your hand up. Awesome. Yep. It is. Yes. Yes. Correct. Correct. Absolutely. Right. Well, the only thing I will say is, I can't tell you what the connection would be except for the grammatical construction in the Old Testament, and everything you quote is from the New Testament, that the grammatical construction in Hebrew match. That's the only thing I can say there. But you're correct. And that's why I think you see the church, especially in that 3rd and 4th century, moving to it being godly men out of the line of Seth because of that notion that if you are a peacemaker, if you are following God, you're considered a son of God. And I think that's why they moved in that direction with that. So I think absolutely, yes. Maybe. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think it goes back to, and I do. I think it goes back to you have at this time. As I said, remember, where does Moses come from? If Moses is writing this, where is he coming out of? He's coming out of Egypt, who has all this mythology, the Egyptian mythology. And so you have these stories that are sharing. Wait till we get to the flood here in just a second. Babylon, they have in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it almost corresponds to the biblical narrative, except it's a couple of different things that are different, and it's a localized flood versus anything else. The Mesopotamian view of the flood was the earth had populated itself so much that they were being loud and noisy, and the gods couldn't sleep, and so they were going to destroy the earth. So I think what Moses is writing, he's not writing to say, this is what actually happened, per se, but rather to say, look, all these crazy stories you get, they're coming from somewhere. And it's just like I told you before, it's like the gossip thing. You know, if I start with Rachel here and tell somebody something and goes around, by the time it gets back over here, it's going to be different. And I think that's kind of what he may be trying to fix here a little bit, or at least coming to that conclusion. Yes. In particular, it's in that Apocrypha thing. I just didn't bring them all out. There's a couple of books in there. The son Barak is one of them. Sirach, which is a wisdom book, mentions it. These are all Apocrypha books. And if the Protestants hadn't pulled it out in the 1800s, we'd still have them in our Bible. If you go get a Catholic Bible, it's sitting in there right now. And it was more of the Protestant movement, I believe, fighting against Catholicism that pulled it out. It was political. You're correct. And so that's where the challenge comes in. And that's why I think sometimes, and Rob and I have talked about wanting to do this, we need to go back and have a study, because it's a very interesting study of how we got the Bible. Because there is a difference between Old Testament and New Testament. There is a difference in how they came and said, okay, we're going to put these 27 books in the Bible, but we're going to put these other ones out. And so the Old Testament we're heavily, and including the Apocrypha, we're heavily influenced by Jewish thinking. And so, but ultimately, let me make sure everybody's clear with all this, and if you got any questions, please do it. We don't know. Ultimately, what we have to gather is, whatever it is, it had caused so much depravity that the earth was not at all what God had created just a few chapters earlier. And I think that is the key. So let's get back here to chapter 6 of kind of seeing what has happened in all of this. Because this is happening, in verse 3, God says, okay, man's not going to be, his flesh, his days are going to be 120 years. So, does that mean man will no longer live more than 120 years? Well, the problem is, you still had people living over 120 years for quite a while, even afterwards. I think what it's meaning is, probably, I'm going to give them 120 more years because that lines up with Noah building the ark. I think that's what he's talking about, is that in 120 years, that's it. I'm doing all this. Now, let's dive into this a little bit more in verse 5. So verses 1 through 4 kind of gives an overview. verse 5, he gets a little deeper into it where it says, the wickedness of man was great on earth, and every intention of his heart was on evil continually. In all of this, you can skip on down. In fact, skip on down to verse 11 because this connects to that. It's kind of a fuller explanation. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Now, this is interesting. That word for violence, you may laugh at this, you may not laugh at this. In Hebrew is Hamas. You ever heard that word before in political word? Hamas, yeah. And so there may be some carryover between, because Hebrew and Arabic are very close, and I would assume there's some carryover, and so I think it's very interesting in there. But this idea that they are violent, verse 12, they are corrupt, for all flesh has corrupted their ways. So everything, go back to chapter 1, everything was good. God said it was very good, and just in a relatively short amount of time, we've taken it out into the other direction in there. Now, verse 6, let's go back to verse 6, because this will take us into another discussion that we have to have now. Verse 6, and the Lord was sorry. Some of the old, if you have old King James, you're going to have God was repentant of it, that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. That word grieved in Hebrew literally means changed his heart, changed his mind. So we have a challenge there, because we are taught what? The general belief about God is what? Okay, where is workmanship? That's correct. But what about love? Okay, we're going to come back to that because love comes out in this story. Unchanging. But God just changed his mind. And so we wrestle with that. And so I was like, all right, where do we get this from? There's one passage in the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 46. Isaiah writes this, Isaiah 46, beginning in let's go back to verse 8. Remember this and stand firm, recall it to the mind of your transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, there is none other like me. I am God, and there is none other like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish my purpose, calling a bird of prey from the east, and so on and so on and so on. That is the closest verse that we have in the Bible. Now there is some stuff in Psalms that is in a poetic way, so you got to understand Psalms is a poetic thing going in there. But that is the only verse where God comes out and that we attach to. God knows everything that's going to happen from beginning to end. So, how does God change his mind? And I think that we wrestle with that. So there's basically three main things in Christianity that people have with the knowledge of God. One, God predestined everything. That's Calvin's idea. Well, actually, it started with Augustine, but Calvin took it and ran with it. And so God has predestined. You're saved, you're not. Because everything is set, and you cannot change it. The second is, well, you have free will, but God already knows what you're going to choose. So it's not predestined, but he already knows what's going to happen in the end with everything and every choice you're going to make. So, but they kind of go together and fight. The third one is called an Arminian view, which is God gives you free will, and it's kind of like if you ever watch Marvel in the multiverse. God knows every choice that you can possibly make and what can possibly come out of it. That one don't even try to think about it. However, That's what a lot of us are, is God knows the possibilities of what, Rick, you can do, and they know that he knows that here's what's going to happen if you turn left, here's what's going to happen if you turn right, but you have the choice to go straight if you want to. Yeah, that's just... The idea of what God knows, first of all, God's character and who he is never changes, okay? The Hebrew writer says Jesus... And he's talking about Jesus, but Jesus is God. If he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, so is God. Meaning what? His character, who he is, what he stands for. God's character does not change. Now, what's about to happen, you're going to think, okay, well, that doesn't seem like a very loving God, until you skip down to verse 8. But God gave favor to Noah. Right? Gave grace to Noah. Okay, we'll come back to that too here in just a second. God cannot sit here and look and he sees his perfect creation being something so depraved and so evil and so violent that he says, we can't have anything to do with this. And it says he was grieved because this was not his plan. So it kind of gives you the idea that God lets man live and God works within us. Now, are there certain things that are going to happen? Well, yes, Jesus was going to come. Did God plan from the very beginning that Jesus was going to come on this date and this time in this part of the world? I don't know. I'm not God. I can't answer that. But what the text leads you to believe right in here is that God let man live, and when man made a mess of it, God said, I can't take this anymore. I'm sorry that I made man. It grieved him that he made man. So, let's go back to Genesis now. So, the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I've created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things, and the birds of the heaven, for I am sorry I made them. So the appearance is, it's not just man that has messed up, so has the animals. Or men have messed up the animals for it. So what you're having here is, look at where we have come. In Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, man and animals are in harmony with each other, and they're in harmony with God. Then the fall happens. He kicks them out. And then you have this division between humanity and animals. And now you've come to the place where God says, we're done with this, okay? So I'm sorry I made man, but, verse 8, Noah found grace in the eyes of God. So Noah is a man, and we're going to go through this here in a second and talk about Noah here, of why Noah is picked. But he is somebody that's apparently separated himself from the rest of them. Yes, whoever sent me that text, by the way, yes, in the spiritual world, you're absolutely correct. I don't know who sent me this text about angels. Yes, I totally agree with you in that phrase. Verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Oh, maybe somebody's watching this and they sent this to me. Oh, that may be what's happening. Oh, it was Freddie who sent that to me. That was Freddie who said that. Yes, Freddie, I agree in the spiritual world, you're right. All right, verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Now, this gives you the clue of why he found it. Noah is a guy, blameless here does not mean he never sinned. Okay? It means he walked with God. He walked in a way that was trying to do what's right and trying to follow God's ways. You and I, in a sense, blameless. We're trying to do what's right. Doesn't mean that we don't sin, but we're trying to follow after God's righteousness, which leads you to think why that line of Seth is continuing. Hold on, let me get Ken had his hands up then. Yes. Whatever. Yep. Sure. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. You're correct, and I don't either. The only thing that I can say is you do have God talking to people, to the fathers throughout all of this, and that this is, I think, what Moses is trying to do is to distinguish the line of Seth, that these were people who tried to listen to what Adam had said, and then Seth, and then all the way down and to Lamech, and well, Methuselah, then Lamech, then Noah, and that these fathers were teaching their kids. But that is an assumption. I don't know. It's a very good question. We don't know, and it goes back to one of these things. As I said, I wish God would have filled in. I wish Moses would have filled in some of these holes, because it is a good question. How did they know to write? I don't know. Maybe God was speaking to them on a continual basis. I don't know. Yeah. Yes, and that's the kind of the way that the Hebrew word takes it. The blameless is that he wanted to do what God wanted, and he was trying to keep with him. And it distinguishes that Noah and his family wasn't falling into what the rest of mankind was doing at that point. At least it seems to be that way. At least that's the way the text is leading it. Yeah. Because it is the same phraseology, because who else has walked with God? Enoch, which would be his, what, great-grandfather in there? So you kind of have that going on. So you got the earth being corrupt. It's filled with violence. The earth was corrupt, all the flesh. And God said in verse 13, I am determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy the earth. And you get this vision of creation happening again, because what he's setting up is what he separated out on creation. Remember when the world was created, what was it? The world was just what? It was a ball of water. And then God is going to spend on day 4 and separate, right, the waters. And this is a rebirth that's kind of getting ready to happen here and go back to things. So, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of this stuff, just some of these things. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. Nobody knows what gopher wood is. It's actually a transliteration of a Hebrew word that if you were to put it in English, it's G-O-P-E-R. Most likely, as what most people can get to, if you have an NIV, you probably have a different word in there. It will say cypress. And so scholars seem to think maybe the closest piece of wood to this is probably cypress, whatever gopher wood is. We don't know what it is. So here's what we're going to do. You make it, make rooms in the ark, cover it inside with pitch. This is how you're to make it, 300 cubits, the length, the breadth's 50, height's 30. So a cubit, about 18 inches. For man, so we're talking about what, 450 feet, 150 feet, and what, I'm lost on 30 over there. This is what we're building in here. I'm not going to go into that. Verse 16, make a roof of the ark, finish it to a cubit above, set a door. Notice what God is doing. God is making a covenant with Abraham. But who's in charge of this covenant? God is. God is saying, here's what I want you to do. He didn't leave it up to Noah to say, here's what you need to do or how we're going to build this. This is where you start deviating from like the Babylonian in the Epic of Gilgamesh in their version of this, that Gilgamesh is told he needs to build this ark because this flood's coming, and he goes and gets wood makers and artisans and stuff like this to figure out how to build one. And in fact, theirs was listed way bigger than this ark that's in here. So, all right, verse 17. Behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. Okay, doesn't have to worry about the sea creatures because they can go underwater, but everything on the earth is going to go. Behold, I will establish my covenant with you. So this is actually the first covenant that we have. At least it's the first covenant that we have recorded. Whether or not God had I guess you can say God had a covenant with Adam and Eve, but this is where God is specifically saying, I'm making an arrangement with you. And here's what you're going to do. You shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wives and your sons' wives with you, and every living thing of all flesh. You shall bring 2 of every sort in the ark and keep them alive with you. They shall be made male and female, of the birds according to its kind, of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping things of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall come into you to keep you, and to you to keep them alive. So how are they going to get there? He's bringing them. Whatever, I don't know how it's going. Meaning God is doing this. There is something within it, and as we see, and we'll get to that point, it's going to take them 120 years to build the ark. The week before, here come the animals to start coming to them. Something that God did to them made them move. I don't know how. That's what the text says, and that's what we're going with in all of that. Now, I know we like to sit here and say, well, this was 2 by 2 and there was only 2 of every kind. That's not the case, especially not of clean animals. Verse 2 of chapter 7, take with you 7 pairs of clean animals. Oh, so it's not just a male and female of every kind. It is even of clean animals, you're taking 7 of those pairs in. So that's something I think as kids we kind of miss, because we're always saying 2 by 2, and they may have come in 2 by 2, but, whatever a clean animal could have been, let's say a cow, and you would have had 7 males and 7 females coming in. So it's how that works. So verse 21 also take with you every sort of food that is eaten and store it up. It shall serve you for food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all of this as God has commanded. Now, we do not know yet at this time had they started eating animals. We technically don't know. It seems to be at the very beginning, at least with Adam and Eve, they're vegetarians. And maybe after the fall they've started doing this. Maybe that's part of why there's so many animals on board. I don't know. Also, at this point, it is interesting that he puts in verse 7, or in chapter 7, clean and unclean animals. They'd have absolutely no idea about clean and unclean animals because that hasn't happened yet. Moses is writing from a perspective of, oh, we're here, but let me talk to you about this. And oh yeah, by the way, they brought in clean animals and unclean animals. Noah, they're animals, okay, in all of this. So however God brought them, God did all of this. So unless they had a law already, and then we have to go in and we just don't know. Yes, you are correct. We just don't know. So let's jump in chapter 7 here a little bit. So Noah has been preaching, according to Peter, for 120 years, okay? So he's been preaching for 120 years, and while he is building this, he's known as the preacher of righteousness, right? He's been preaching to them, hey, this is coming, hey, you need to change your life, whatever it is. And so God has said, okay, here we go, it's time, and we are done with this. And so God tells him, go into the ark, you and your household, for I have seen you are righteous before me in this generation. Kind of leads you to think what? That he puts it in that phrase. Why do you think Moses phrases it that way? When he says, I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. We don't know. Sure. Sure. Well, we do know at least he had the command of, here's how I want you to build the ark, and here's how I want you to do this. Yes, but how? Yes, and it almost seems like, was God testing him? It's interesting that Moses phrases it that way, that God is saying to Noah, I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. So remember, God's going to tell Noah when he's 500 years old, hey, this is what's going to happen. Need you to build an ark. Need you to do all this. Now Noah is 620 years old, and he's still faithful to God in all of this. So kind of like, hey, I've seen you stuck with it. You kept with all of this. So, because remember when you get to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, it says, what? By faith, Noah did all of these things. So, kind of goes in there. So, okay, go ahead. Nothing silly. Mm-hmm. What do y'all think? Mm-hmm. Well, and I do think that there is patience within all that. And that goes back to why I said a second ago, some of you were talking about love and things like this. This is God being loving. Number one, instead of destroying all the earth and saying, I'm done with it, he gave Noah and his family a chance. Not only that, he gave them the tools and the instructions on how to survive this. And it took 120 years to do it. I have to believe, knowing how God is, thinking, I guess I go back to Nineveh. And when, or even, not even Nineveh, let's go to Sodom and Gomorrah. When Abram is like, hey, if I can find 50, will you do it? Yeah, 40, 30, 10. Yep, if you find 10, I'll spare them. I have to believe that if one person would have said, yeah, you're right, I'm wrong, I have to believe he would probably let them come on in. But apparently that shows the depravity of the world. Yeah, and I do. She was saying in 1 Peter 3, when Peter's talking about the patience of God, and then we go into that whole section in there, that is that God being patient to maybe see people to repent. Now, here's something that's in here. I think Methuselah dies either right before the flood or in the flood. Because his year, if you were to look at it, it's going to end the year of the flood. So either he dies right before or after, and it seems to be that's Noah's grandfather. So, he seems to be a good person in all that. It's a good question. Or this goes back to what does God know, when does he know it type of thing is, maybe he looks at Methuselah's age and he realizes he can't repopulate the earth, and so I'm going to choose his grandson who's got 3 kids because now we got to start over again. I don't know. I see. This is all the craziness, that the rabbit holes that we can go down in this discussion. But I think at some point, I'll speak for myself, I've had questions about these things of how did all this happen? How did God work all of these things? And I don't know. I wish I did know. I wish he had given us a little bit more for all of this. So, all right, so let's dive back in here. So now we got in verse 2, we got those 7 pairs coming in. Verse 3, 7 pairs of the birds. And you got all these things coming in. Verse 4, for in 7 days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded. Now this is interesting. We do not know, but most likely, especially going back from what we've read in the Garden of Eden and some of the things afterwards, they probably have never seen rain, most likely. So this is going to be different that's coming. Because remember, it was always kind of the mist of the ground that got the plants and took care of all of that in there. So, but you have this. Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. So, and now in verse 6, you got the flood waters coming on the earth. So Noah and his wife, they went into the ark to escape it. Verse 7, clean animals come in, and here come the creeping things, and blah, blah, blah. Verse 10, after 7 days, the waters of the flood came on the earth. And here we are in the 600th year of Noah's life. The second month, on the 17th day of the month. So he's getting specific in here. And here's where you get the hint of what is beginning to take place. So let's pay attention to this for a second. The fountains of the deep, great deep, burst forth. That's one thing where water is coming from. And the second thing, another thing that water is coming from, and the windows of heavens were open. And the rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So, two things. What are the fountains of the deep? Well, a lot of people will say that this is underwater, rivers, springs bursting forth. And I think there's definitely a piece of that is coming into play with this. I also lean that there's something else that can also be included in that as well. Because you also have, and that ties into the second part, the windows of heaven were open. And that's what the word literally means. It's basically like God opened the windows and it's just a huge deluge of water that comes down. Well, that's a lot of water for 40 days and 40 nights. Where's it been all this time? This is what goes in, and I will go ahead and, I don't know how long we'll get into this, but we will try this. Some people call it the Noahic flood theory. Some people call it the canopy theory, or hypothesis. I guess you shouldn't call it a theory because you can't prove it yet, but a hypothesis of what this is. Any of you ever seen when Mount St. Helens erupted? What happened after it erupted? Okay, phone, thank you. I didn't need you to tell me about that. Siri is telling me on the day when Mount St. Helens erupted. What happened after it erupted? You ever see pictures? I'm not talking about the devastation. There's one particular thing that happened while it was erupting. It began to rain. Because volcanic ash is a seeding for clouds. It seeds clouds. And if there are clouds around or precipitation around, it will rain. So, part of the fountains of the deep could be the underground magma, volcanoes, and everything else erupting as well, seeding the clouds, and it's opening it up like a deluge to come down, because this goes back to chapter day 4. Remember back in day 4 where it says we have waters, and then we have a firmament right here in the middle. Remember, I've kind of hinted around at this about a greenhouse effect. Okay? And so this also plays into the idea of the division of continents, of the earthquakes and tremors to separate the continents out, which there seems to be scientific evidence that there is at least something being spread around. And so you have all of this taking shape and taking form in here, and all of it coming down. Now, if you've done any study, you've done anything, somebody mentioned a couple weeks ago, well, where's the ice age come from? So first of all, this is an extinction level event. We're wiping everything out. Any of you ever read about like things in the tundra or the Arctic and finding tropical plants in the tundra and the Arctic? Plants that you would find like in Florida or the Caribbean, and you're like, how did it get up there? Okay, yep, they found fish like in Mount Everest. You find like the mammoths, when they would find them out in the Arctic, and inside their stomach they have tropical plants inside of them. So the theory goes as this, is that the world was basically one temperature. It was a tropical environment. That's the theory, that's the hypothesis, because that firmament acted as a greenhouse. Remember, I said, how did we get groundwater to come out? Well, in a greenhouse, you've ever walked in a greenhouse, it's very humid, right? And it starts doing all of this. And so if this firmament is full of water and it's a giant cloud, well, it's going to take 40 days to get it all out. Here's the other part of that theory. What ages us? What makes us older? What ages us? The sun does. If you will notice, after this takes place, you get through a generation or so, what happens to the ages of mankind? It plummets. It starts to plummet. Also, UV radiation changes your DNA, changes genetic. We start having genetic mutations. So you have, in these early days, brothers and sisters marrying. Well, now when you have brothers and sisters start marrying, then you start having more genetic challenges. Well, my mom and dad wasn't brother and sister, but apparently they're cousins. And so some of my stuff, don't you laugh at me, Judy. Thanks a lot. I never should have said that out loud. Now Judy's never going to let me live that down. No, God, thanks. But I have my issues that I have with triglycerides in particular are because of that genetic trait. So all of this comes into play. As I said, this is a hypothesis in here. However, it makes a lot of sense of some things. So we'll talk more about that. But this is where, speaking of your extinction level event and ice age, so if everything is one temperature, and then all of a sudden, and particularly in the northern and southern hemispheres, we take away that blanket that's keeping everything warm, well, what's going to happen? It's going to freeze. And things are going to freeze. Now, also, you can go into other stuff too, and I'm not getting into climate change or whatever else, but that's called the Noatic flood theory or the canopy theory, that this is where all that water comes from, because as we'll read, and we'll get into this next week, it covers everything. There is no mountains, there is no land. It's completely covered, and it's going to be completely covered for what? Another 4 months of water after all the rain gets done. But what God is doing is now it's a rebirth for the earth. And everything is new, everything is wiped out, and they have to start over. And so we'll talk about that next week. Questions? Let me ask you that. Questions, comments? Okay, next week. We'll talk more about it next week. Rachel's got questions. I can see it in her eyes. I know you're thinking.